So sincerity means to want God for the sake of God, not for any worldly gain, nor for any other motivation of the hereafter. So God cannot be sought, i.e., we cannot devote to God through the fear of hell, nor through the want of paradise. In the final analysis, we cannot even want God in order for us to have this proximity of God or proximity with God, because that then invokes the I-ness. I want proximity to God, and that defeats the whole purpose of evolving towards God. Now, in this relation, we have to understand that it's a gradual process. We are embodied creatures. We are in a state of body. The body has its needs, and it gives birth to the ego. To purge ourselves of our bodily facets and consequently of the ego is a gradual process. In that process, we are supposed to be very sincere with God. So we may approach God in sincerity, declaring our inability and inadequate state. So I can say to God, oh God, I know I need to trust you, that you destine what is best. But oh Lord, I cannot bear this sickness. Grant me health. We can be very honest with God and say, oh Allah, I am doing this for your sake, but you know very well that my ego derives pleasure from it, all the charitable work that I do or religious work. This God appreciates and accepts. The Prophet has said there is a state of hidden shirk, association with God. That hidden shirk is the want of the ego or reliance on other than God, which infringes with that pure want of being with God. But the Blessed Prophet said it is forgiven. So be authentic, be yourself, be sincere in attaining the fullness of sincerity. The fullness of sincerity is parting of the veil between God and any other motivation. The motivation has to be strictly God and nothing else. But we arrive at it slowly, and the method to arrive at it is again to be sincere of the way we are with God. Now, we may come to that Abrahamic state from time to time, and when we do internally, then we need to pay heed to it. When Abraham was being flung into the fire, Jibrail asked him to plead to God to save him and to rescue him. Abraham's sentiment at that point was, God or Jibrail, I have trusted in God. I leave the discretion in his hand. If he wishes to burn me to ashes, then it is his choice. If he wishes to save me, then it is his call. I will not inform God of what to do, nor ask him to do. Now, this is a very befitting attitude for us whilst we are wayfaring to God. We can say, oh Allah, these are my demands, these are my needs, these are my fears, these are my apprehensions. I do not want to go to hell. I do want to be in a place of paradise. I do want to be in your proximity. I do want health. I do want children. I do want happiness. But oh Allah, if you choose otherwise, then keep me pleased with your choice. And that is what God is signifying in the Quran, that He is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. Oh, that contented soul, being pleased with God and God being pleased with the soul. So sincerity works in this way. Now, moving on to the next chapter. The first chapter was directing ourselves in our journey to God. The next chapter is removal of obstacles from the journey. So now, we may make an intention of going somewhere. However, if there is a roadblock, we will not be able to get there. We have to remove the blockade from the road. In our context, the obstructions and the obstacles are internal. It is an internal affair. What is it that prevents us from getting to our destination? Our destination is God. What is the prevention? The prevention is us, the I-ness. This removal of the I-ness is known as Tawbah, reversion to God. Now, in the final analysis, there is only one obstacle, and that is the ego. But the way we go about removing the ego is by removing the adverse effects of the ego so that the ego is starved gradually. We cannot obliterate the ego unless, of course, God wishes to overpower our states and efface us as he did with Moses. He effaced the mountain of his ego, and Moses collapsed, and he awoke a believer, a faithful with unshakable faith. Our journey is for us to deny the ego its sustenance so that the ego may become dimmed and the light of God may prevail. This is known as Tawbah or reversion. Now, as we go into this topic, there is a distinction between Istighfar and Tawbah. Istighfar is seeking forgiveness from a moment in which we have sinned. So when we have said something unbefitting, we do istighfar. When we commit a wrongful act, we do istighfar. When we entertain an unbefitting thought, we do istighfar. What is Tawbah? Tawbah is a perpetual existential state. I often explain this on the plains of Arafah when we go to Hajj, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises, obviously through his prophets and through the language of the beloved Imam or the pronouncements of the beloved Imams, that the most wretched soul on the plains of Arafah is the one who assumes that God has not forgiven him in spite of giving the promise that he will forgive. So God forgives every sins on the plains of Arafah. However, this is to be understood as cleaning the slate. You can clean the slate and there will be no more sins on the slate. But the human soul is not like a slate. The human soul's analogy is more like the physical brain. If the brain develops a tumor, the tumor oozes from within the brain, and there's a lesion and appearance of the tumor outside on the surface of the brain. During surgery, the tumor is scraped from the surface of the brain. This scraping off of the tumor is what happens on the plains of Arafah when we do istighfar. God removes it, but it cannot stop the oozing of the tumor. What I mean to say here is that sin, one is a trait, the other is the expression of it. The trait of sin that is existentially with us because we've become accustomed to it, habituated to it, that will require struggle and work. So istighfar cleanses the sin by rubbing off the slate. Tawbah is addressing a perpetual state within that cannot help but manifest sin. So a person habituated to negativity may seek forgiveness, and that particular negative thought or speech might be forgiven. But the propensity of negativity from within does not stop. That is where Tawbah becomes meaningful. Tawbah is the whole practice of looking inward and addressing those traits that are within us. Being negative, being lazy, having the want to lie, being greedy, being avarice. Although all of these are existential states and they have their own good use, and maybe we can discuss that somewhere else, but they are problematic nonetheless if they are not understood accurately. Now, the removal of these things require us to acknowledge them. Only through acknowledgement that, look, I'm a very insecure person. I'm a very distrusting person. I am a person who is prone to lying because I cannot withstand the consequence of being truthful. I'm a very lustful person. I am gluttonous, for example, so on and so forth. I suffer from indifference in my soul, and these are things that are unbefitting. First, we need to admit to this particular state that we have. And then, after we've diagnosed our state, we do not loathe ourselves, we do not hate ourselves, but we go about working internally. Now, remembering of a sin is good because it humbles us. The Blessed Prophet said, that sin or mistake after which there is remorse, and reformation is more befitting than a good deed after which there is conceit. Remembering a sin is good because it humbles us and it does not allow us to judge other people. And that is the whole process of wayfaring through Tawbah. One of the biggest thing about Tawbah is for I to prevail and to judge others. So remembrance of sins is very, very good. However, at some point, remembrance of sin and Tawbah in itself becomes an obstacle. How? When we cannot rid ourselves of the thoughts of all the inadequacies that we have and the transgressions that we have committed, it takes away our confidence from approaching our God. I'll give a little example, an analogy. Having failed the driving test for multiple times, when you go into the car for um, God knows how many, fifth or sixth or 10th time, you will have those thoughts of earlier failures haunting you. And that in itself will determine a subsequent failure. If a person has failed in their exams, if they carry that memory into the examination room, and if that memory is haunting them, then they will fail again. So the art of Tawbah means to also remove sins through forgetting them, so that the sins are not reinforced through their memory. As Mahmud Shabistri says, do Tawbah from Tawbah in the sense of throw Tawbah away, because Tawbah itself becomes an obstacle. Go to your God in a state of utmost innocence. Presume yourself as forgiven and innocent, because that will be most appropriate in the whole process of Tawbah to getting to God. Now, when we do Tawbah, at times the soul realizes its state of utmost humility before God. Tawbah means to turn back. Turn back where? To that original untarnished state that we were at before we became embodied and became disillusioned with our own state of existence. And we began to imagine that we are the worldly and we are these bodies. But what happens sometimes is that the soul becomes so humble that it says to God, I cannot revert to you. I just don't have the ability or the strength. It is at this point that we are told to say, Tub, Allah, you turn to me now. I can't turn to you. I need your parental love, and I need to invoke that to overpower you and for you to turn to me and to come and assure me that I am not as bad as what I've imagined myself to be. Now, when does forgiveness occur? The forgiveness occurs at the loss of the tendency of sin. So if a thief loses the tendency of sin, that sin has gone. So it's forgetting and doing away with the memory of it and losing the tendency of it. Similarly, if a greedy person, by giving excessive charity, remedies the greed from within, then that sin of greed has gone. Similarly, if a person who is jealous can excessively practice being happy for others through what God has given them, then that sin of jealousy has gone. Similarly, a person who does not want good for others or cannot see good coming to others, if they can become sincere and acknowledge that there is that problem in them, and they are able to be pleased for the other and not intend ill for them, then that sin has gone. Now, these sins from which we need to do Tawbah, they are reducible. We can reduce them all to one major sin, and that is the ego and pride and the I-ness. But as I said, we cannot obliterate the I. It's a very, very, very unsurmountable task. So what we do is we starve the ego of what reinforces it and fuels it. The Prophet said, on the day of Qiyamah, people will be raised in the forms of animals and insects. The people asked, how will we recognize them? The Prophet said, no, you will have no difficulty in recognizing each other. They said, well, why will we be raised in the forms of animals? The Prophet said, those were the qualities that predominated within your souls. And those are the qualities with which you will awaken before God, because the inner being will project itself outwardly. We need to understand that our I-ness is identified by a lot of bodily traits: greed, jealousy, avarice, desires, lust, so on and so forth, anger, rage. That is the form of the soul. The only way to remedy that is to become mindful of it and then to starve it. How do we starve it? Now, I've only got a few more minutes, so I'll be quick with this. First, to become very, very mindful of the ordinances of the Sharia. There is halal and there is haram. There is wajib and there is haram. Halal, eat that. Haram, abstain from it. Wajib, attend to it. Do not abstain from it. Then there is mustahab and then there is makruh. But it has to be done in a very gradual, slow way for it to be effective. The Prophet said, worship which is limited but done habitually is worthier than worship in which there is no habit. Consistency is needed. Once the soul becomes accustomed to one level of worship, then move on to mustahabat and avoid the makruhat. That is the first level of starving the inner being of what fuels it. The second level is to come to the words, to the level of the words, to use the words appropriately that do not either hurt anybody else nor give a false sense of self-glorification. I mean, I've often noticed when somebody asks me a question, I don't only reply, I embellish the reply in order to project my own ego for the sake of appreciation of others, to curtail the words. That does not mean we speak less. We can have an entertaining conversation, but it has to be a truthful one in which there is God, that God is watching over this conversation. Then we come to a level of mind and thought, that we cannot entertain unbefitting thoughts. So the haram and halal, wajib and makruh and mustahab goes from the level of the bodily postures to the words, to the eyes, to the ears, and to the mind itself. The final level of Tawbah, obviously, in our existential state, we will have moments of it only, unless, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wishes to bring us into a perpetual state towards the end of our lives, is a Tawbah from being distracted from God in those moments in which we are distracted from God. So whenever we are distracted from God, we need to bring ourselves back to mindfulness that God is present. He permeates my being and I am available to him. It is discourteous for me to not pay attention to the one who is sitting with me next to me. That particular sense of presence of God dawns upon us. It is like being in front of the Prophet himself. And whilst you are in the presence of the Prophet, you are busy in your own brain thinking of other things, or on our iPhones or Samsung, and nobody has paid me to mention those names, and become distracted with our gaming devices. It's very discourteous and disrespectful. When the presence of God is felt that intensely, then Tawbah is when we become mindless of God. But as I said, God hides himself as a mercy so that we can indulge in the bodily aspect of life. If the presence of God was that acutely felt by us at all times, at this stage, before our death, life would become an impossible task. I will leave it there.